Roxana, The Fortunate Mistress. Full title, The Fortunate Mistress, or Roxana, The Fortunate Mistress. Full title, The Fortunate Mistress, or A History of the Life and Vast Variety of Fortunes of Mademoiselle de Below, afterwards called the Countess de Winselsheim, in Germany, being the person known by the name of the Lady Roxana, in the time of King Charles II, is a 1724 novel by Daniel Defoe. Daniel Defoe, DFO, born Daniel Foe, c. 1660, the 24th of April 1731, was an English writer, trader, journalist, pamphleteer and spy. He is most famous for his novel Robinson Crusoe, published in 1719, which is claimed to be second only to the Bible in its number of translations. 2. He has been seen as one of the earliest proponents of the English novel, and helped to popularize the form in Britain with others such as Aphra Behn and Samuel Richardson. 3. Defoe wrote many political tracts, was often in trouble with the authorities, and spent a period in prison. Intellectuals and political leaders paid attention to his fresh ideas and sometimes consulted him. Defoe was a prolific and versatile writer, producing more than 300 works, 4 books, pamphlets, and journals, on diverse topics, including politics, crime, religion, marriage, psychology and the supernatural. He was also a pioneer of business journalism, 5, and economic journalism. Summary. Born in France, from which her parents fled because of religious persecution, Roxana grew to adolescence in England. At the age of 15, she married a handsome but conceited man. After 8 years of marriage, during which time her husband went through all of their money, Roxana is left penniless with 5 children. She appeals for aid to her husband's relatives, all of whom refuse her except one old aunt, who is in no position to help her materially. Amy, Roxana's maid, refuses to leave her mistress although she receives no wages for her work. Another poor old woman whom Roxana had aided during her former prosperity adds her efforts to those of the old aunt and Amy. Finally, Amy plots to force the 5 children at the house of the sister of Roxana's fled husband, which she does. The cruel sister-in-law will raise the 5 children, with the help of her kinder husband. Roxana is penniless and at the point of despair when Mr. her landlord, after expressing his admiration for her, praises her fortitude under all of her difficulties and offers to set her up in housekeeping. He returns all the furniture he had confiscated, gives her food and money, and generally conducts himself with such kindness and candor that Amy urges Roxana to become the gentleman's mistress should he ask it. Roxana, however, clings to her virtuous independence. Fearing that the gentleman's kindness will go unrewarded, Amy, because she loves her mistress, offers to lie with the landlord in Roxana's place. This offer, however, Roxana refuses to consider. The 2 women talk much about the merits of the landlord, his motive in befriending Roxana, and the moral implications of his attentions. When the landlord comes to take residence as a boarder in Roxana's house, he proposes, since his wife has deserted him, that he and Roxana live as husband and wife. To show his good faith, he offers to share his wealth with her, bequeathing her £500 in his will and promising £7,000 if he leaves her. There is a festive celebration that evening and a little joking about Amy's offer to lie with the gentleman. Finally Roxana, her conscience still bothering her, yields to his protestations of love and has sex with him. After a year and a half has passed and Roxana has not conceived a child, Amy chides her mistress for her barrenness. Feeling that Mr. is not her true husband, Roxana sends Amy to him to beget a child. Amy does bear a child, which Roxana takes as her own to save the maid embarrassment. 2 years later, Roxana has a daughter, who dies within 6 weeks. A year later, she pleases her lover with a son. Mr. takes Roxana with him to Paris on business. There they live in great style until Roxana has a vision in which Mr. dies and tries to convince him to stay. To reassure her he gives the case of valuable jewels he carries with him to her, should he be robbed. This ominous assertion proves true and was murdered by thieves after the case of jewels which he was rumored to always carry. Roxana manages to retain the gentleman's wealth and secure it against the possible claims of his wife or any of his living relatives. Roxana moves up through the social spectrum by becoming the mistress of a German prince who came to pay his respects to her following the jeweler's murder. After carrying on the affair for some time, she becomes pregnant with his child, so he sets her up in a country house just outside of Paris where she can give birth to the child without bringing any scandal down upon the prince. Their relationship is an affectionate one, with the prince seeming to spend a great deal of time with Roxana despite having a wife. Nevertheless, Roxana has some regrets about the situation her newest son has been born into, destined to be marked by the low status of his mother and the illegitimacy of the relationship between her and his father. Later, Roxana and the prince travel to Italy where he has business to attend to, and there they live together for 2 years. During this time she is gifted a Turkish slave who teaches her the Turkish language and Turkish customs, and a Turkish dress which will become central to her later character development. Also in Italy, Roxana gives birth to another son, however this child does not survive long. Upon their return to Paris, the prince's wife, the princess, becomes ill and dies. The prince, humbled and repentant, decides to no longer keep Roxana as a mistress and live a life closer to God. As a result, Roxana decides to return to England, but being considerably richer than when she arrived thanks to the jeweler and the prince, she gets in contact with a Dutch merchant who could help her to move her considerable wealth back to England. Roxana wishes to sell the jewels in the case the jeweler had left her the day he died, and the Dutch merchant arranges for them to be appraised by a Jew. The Jew recognized the jewels as being the ones which had been allegedly stolen from an English jeweler many years prior. The Jew demands that she should be brought to the police, for she was surely the thief, and plots to keep the jewels for himself. The Dutch merchant alerts Roxana of the Jew's scheme and they devise a plan to get her out of France and secure her passage to England through Holland. Roxana successfully evades the Jew and the law and ends up safely in Holland where the Dutch merchant joins her. The merchant courts her and manages to bed her, hoping she would then agree to marry him. Roxana makes her intentions to remain single clear, to the merchant's astonishment. Roxana ends up becoming pregnant, which makes the merchant plead for her to marry him so that the child should not be a bastard, which she still refuses. Roxana returns to England on a ship which nearly founders in a storm, on which Amy is stricken with guilt for her sins and wicked ways, but Roxana believes there is no truth in sea storm repentance and promises, so she herself does not feel the need to repent as Amy does, but she realizes that anything Amy is guilty of, she is much more guilty of. Upon arriving in England, Amy sets Roxana's estate up in London as Roxana returns to get the other half of her money in Holland. Roxana sets herself up in Pall Mall, invests her money, and becomes a great hostess in England where she becomes famous for her parties and the Turkish dress she wears and the Turkish dance the slave taught her. This exotic display earns her the name of Roxana. Prior to this moment, Roxana is never named, we only know she is called Roxana through this incident, but that her true name is Susan, according to a comment she makes later about her daughter. She quickly gains a lot of attention, and a 3-year gap is announced, and implies she even became mistress to the king, who saw her at one of her parties. Following this she becomes an old man's mistress, which she becomes quickly sick of. Her reputation as a mistress and a whore tires her, and she wishes to lead a more simple life. Roxana moves to the outskirts of London and takes board in a Quaker woman's house, with whom she quickly becomes friends. This modest house allows her to become a new person and hide from those who may want to harm her. One day she comes across the Dutch merchant who had helped her return to England, and marriage is envisaged. Roxana finally relents on her wish to remain independent and they marry. Hoping to avoid the children from her first marriage should they come looking for her, she moves to Holland with the Dutch merchant where she becomes a countess to her great pleasure. However, her new life is threatened by the reappearance of her oldest daughter, Susan, which Roxana admits to be named after her, unveiling possibly her true name. Susan's motives to have her mother recognize her as her daughter are unclear. Nevertheless, Roxana feels threatened, and Amy proposes to murder her. The novel ends on ambiguity as to whether Amy actually kills Susan. Roxana only laments the crime that has tainted her life, strongly suggesting Susan was murdered for Roxana to retain her status and reputation. The text ends on an unfinished note, with Roxana living in wealth with her husband in Holland, but assuring the reader that events eventually bring her low and she repents for her actions and experiences a downturn in fortune. Themes. The novel examines the possibility of 18th-century women owning their own estate despite living in a patriarchal society, as with Roxana's claim that the marriage contract is nothing but giving up liberty, estate, authority, and everything to the man. 1. The novel also draws attention to the incompatibility between sexual freedom and freedom from motherhood. Roxana becomes pregnant many times due to her sexual exploits, and it is one of her children, Susan, who comes back to expose her, years later, near the novel's close, to helping to precipitate her flight abroad, her subsequent loss of wealth, and her ambiguous repentance. 3. The character of Roxana can be described as a proto-feminist because she engages in prostitution for her own ends of freedom, before a feminist ideology was fully formed, though Defoe also works to undercut the radicalism of her position. 4. The book also explores the clash of values between the Restoration court and the middle class. 5. Roxana also discusses the issues of truth and deceit. As the text is a first-person narration and written to simulate a real first-hand account by a woman, first comes the issue of subjectivity, but also an underlying problem as to the veracity of the text. The reader can only trust in Roxana to give us a true account, but as she often lies to other characters in the book, and even to herself, she is not a reliable narrator. Further, her character is constructed from lies and disguises. Roxana, the name that is most associated with her, is based on her disguise of Turkish dress, and her real name is not mentioned until the end of the novel. Published anonymously, and not attributed to Defoe till 1775, Roxana was nonetheless a popular hit in the 18th century, frequently reprinted in altered versions to suit the taste of the day. Thus the 1775 edition, which called itself the New Roxana, had been sentimentalized to meet the tastes of the day. 6. Only gradually from the 19th century onwards did the novel begin to be treated as serious literature. The Canadian writer Ethel Wilson has been one of the 20th century authors subsequently influenced by its matter-of-factness and freedom from cant. 7. Roxana, the fortunate mistress character list. Roxana. The protagonist and narrator of the novel, Roxana, is a nickname she earns during her time as a wealthy London courtesan, and her birth name seems to have been Susan. She gives birth to a total of 11 children, fathered by 4 different men: the brewer, the jeweler landlord, the prince, and the Dutch merchant. She is legally married twice. Roxana experiences many adventures and changes of fortune, but proves herself to be intelligent, resilient, and adaptable. She is also very beautiful, and leverages her appearance by becoming the mistress of wealthy men, and eventually building her own fortune. Roxana is capable of feeling genuine love and affection for some of her children and some of her lovers, especially the Dutch merchant, but she is also greedy, vain, and ambitious. Because of all her lies, Roxana is also forced to live in a web of deceit and to be constantly afraid of being detected. The landlord jeweler. A wealthy man who works as a jewel merchant and also owns the home that Roxana and her first husband rent for themselves and their family. When Roxana is penniless, he tries to help her, but he is also clearly interested in a sexual relationship. Once he and Roxana are lovers, he seems to treat her fairly and kindly. The two of them live together happily, first in England and then in France. He is murdered in a failed robbery while on the road to Versailles. Amy. A maid-servant who is employed by Roxana during her first marriage to the brewer. All in all, the two women spend 30 years of their lives in very close contact, often living together. Amy is smart, pragmatic, and an excellent problem solver. She repeatedly comes to Roxana's aid in difficult situations, beginning when Roxana has no money and cannot provide for herself or her children. Amy remains very loyal to Roxana, and gets to enjoy her lifestyle as Roxana becomes extremely wealthy. Amy has a bizarre affair with the landlord, orchestrated by Roxana during their marriage, and gives birth to a daughter. She also has a lengthy affair with a gentleman employed by the prince during the time that Roxana is the prince's mistress. Amy eventually shows how cold and ruthless she can be, when she repeatedly alludes to killing Susan in order to cover up the secret of Roxana's identity, and possibly carries out this murder. Roxana, the fortunate mistress character list. Roxana. The protagonist and narrator of the novel, Roxana, is a nickname she earns during her time as a wealthy London courtesan, and her birth name seems to have been Susan. She gives birth to a total of 11 children, fathered by 4 different men: the brewer, the jeweler landlord, the prince, and the Dutch merchant. She is legally married twice. Roxana experiences many adventures and changes of fortune, but proves herself to be intelligent, resilient, and adaptable. She is also very beautiful, and leverages her appearance by becoming the mistress of wealthy men, and eventually building her own fortune. Roxana is capable of feeling genuine love and affection for some of her children and some of her lovers, especially the Dutch merchant, but she is also greedy, vain, and ambitious. Because of all her lies, Roxana is also forced to live in a web of deceit and to be constantly afraid of being detected. The landlord jeweler. A wealthy man who works as a jewel merchant and also owns the home that Roxana and her first husband rent for themselves and their family. When Roxana is penniless, he tries to help her, but he is also clearly interested in a sexual relationship. Once he and Roxana are lovers, he seems to treat her fairly and kindly. The two of them live together happily, first in England and then in France. He is murdered in a failed robbery while on the road to Versailles. Amy. A maidservant who is employed by Roxana during her first marriage to the brewer. All in all, the two women spend 30 years of their lives in very close contact, often living together. Amy is smart, pragmatic, and an excellent problem solver. She repeatedly comes to Roxana's aid in difficult situations, beginning when Roxana has no money and cannot provide for herself or her children. Amy remains very loyal to Roxana, and gets to enjoy her lifestyle as Roxana becomes extremely wealthy. Amy has a bizarre affair with the landlord, orchestrated by Roxana during their marriage, and gives birth to a daughter. She also has a lengthy affair with a gentleman employed by the prince during the time that Roxana is the prince's mistress. Amy eventually shows how cold and ruthless she can be, when she repeatedly alludes to killing Susan in order to cover up the secret of Roxana's identity, and possibly carries out this murder. The Prince. The prince is a German aristocrat who meets Roxana during his time at Versailles. He is entranced by her beauty, and the two of them have a romantic relationship spanning 8 years and including the birth of 3 children. He is very gallant, and showers Roxana with lavish gifts. When his wife dies, the prince feels guilty for having an affair, and ends the relationship. Years later, he tries to track down Roxana because he still loves her, and is willing to marry her. However, he comes close to death himself, and repents again. The Dutch Merchant. The Dutch merchant is Dutch by nationality, but works primarily in Paris, where he successfully amasses a lot of wealth for himself. He helps Roxana when she is trying to move her assets back to England after the end of her relationship with the prince, and falls in love with her. He fathers Roxana's final child, and always shows a lot of tenderness towards this child. He is eager to marry Roxana and disappointed when she will not agree. He does not want her to simply be his mistress, and this leads to a break in their relationship. When they reunite years later, he is still very loving and devoted, and does everything to make her happy, including buying aristocratic titles. His eventual marriage to Roxana should make them both happy and wealthy, but Roxana remains haunted by her past, which he seems to never be aware of. The Quakeress. The Quaker woman is a member of a religious minority, who lives in a modest household in London and makes a living by renting part of her lodgings out as a landlady. Her husband is mysteriously absent. When Roxana decides to give up her lifestyle as a courtesan, she moves in with the Quaker woman, who becomes a close and trusted friend to her. Roxana never tells the Quaker woman the details of her past, and passes herself off as a modest and virtuous woman. However, the Quaker woman later helps Roxana to avoid being uncovered by Susan, so she clearly knows that Roxana has secrets that she is trying to keep. Susan. Roxana's daughter and namesake. She is sometimes referred to as Roxana's eldest daughter, and sometimes as her youngest. As a young child, Susan is sent to live with her aunt and uncle, and she eventually has to go and work as a servant. She ends up working in the household of the famous courtesan Roxana. When Amy realizes who Susan is, she sends her away from the household, but also provides her with money so that she can get an education and live as a gentlewoman. Susan realizes that Amy is the woman who has provided for her and her siblings, and assumes that Amy is her long-lost mother. Susan is very upset when Amy denies this, and becomes very persistent about tracking down first Amy, and then Roxana. Susan's insistence leads to her being perceived as a threat, and angers Amy. It is strongly implied that Amy murders Susan at the end of the novel. The Brewer. Roxana's first husband, and the father of her first 5 children, including Susan. He is a handsome and charming man, but he is also spoiled, selfish, and foolish. He recklessly spends all of the family's money, leaving them destitute, and then disappears. He reappears years later as a soldier serving in the French army, and dies at the Battle of Mons in 1709. Roxana's brother. A financially careless man, who eventually loses all of his money, goes bankrupt, and goes to prison. His financial losses have implications for Roxana because their father trusted him with money for Roxana when he saw that Roxana's marriage was not going well, but this ends up being lost. The Prince's Gentleman. A servant in the household of the German prince, He has a lengthy affair with Amy during the time when Roxana and the prince are living together, and when Amy returns to France years later, the two of them reunite and renew their relationship. The Jew. A jewel merchant in Paris. When Roxana is trying to liquidate her assets before moving back to England, the Dutch merchant thinks the Jew might buy some of her jewels. However, the Jew recognizes that the jewels have been missing since the death of the landlord jeweler and becomes very suspicious of Roxana. He wants to prosecute her and uncover that her marriage to the jeweler was never legal. He later tries to rob a banker and is forced to flee from Paris. The Sea Captain and the Sea Captain's Wife. When Roxana and the Dutch merchant plan to move to Holland after their marriage, they are going to sail aboard a vessel and spend some time at the home of the captain and his wife first. There, Roxana runs into Susan, who is a close friend of the sea captain's wife, and narrowly avoids detection. The elderly aunt. The aunt of the brewer, an elderly widow who has very little money. When Roxana has been abandoned by the brewer, and is desperately trying to provide for her children, no one from her husband's family shows her any kindness except for the aunt. Unfortunately, the aunt doesn't have enough money to do much, but she does help with the plan to force the children onto their aunt and uncle. The aunt and uncle. The sister of the brewer, and her husband. The aunt is a cold-hearted and selfish woman who does not want to help her brother's children after he abandons them and Roxana. Her husband is more compassionate, and intercedes on their behalf. The poor woman. During Roxana's first marriage, she provides money and help to a poor woman. When Roxana herself loses all of her money, this woman tries to help her, and contributes to the plan for Roxana's children to be sent to a new home. Independence. Independence is a theme that takes on different nuances at different points in the novel. When Roxana is abandoned by her husband the brewer, independence is very stressful and traumatic for her. She does not have the money or the means to support herself and her children. She at first seems unable to function as an independent woman because of societal limitations, so she therefore has to seek out a relationship with the landlord and become dependent on a man. However, once Roxana acquires enough money, she begins to be very attached to her independence. She becomes almost obsessed with obtaining financial security, and becomes mistrustful of the idea of marriage because she thinks that it will restrict her freedom and autonomy. Roxana's pursuit of independence makes her extremely wealthy, but it also eventually makes her lonely. She comes to feel that maintaining her independence is not as important to her as having a loving partnership with the merchant, and possibly even building a relationship with her children. Also, virtually everything that happens in Roxana's life is reliant on her close relationship with Amy, showing that she is never totally independent and self-reliant. Rather, Roxana seeks a form of independence wherein she can choose whom she trusts and brings into her life. Moral ambiguity. Throughout the novel, Amy and Roxana often debate and discuss the morality of certain actions, and whether or not it is acceptable to carry them out. Most notably, Roxana and Amy debate whether or not Roxana should have a sexual relationship with the landlord jeweler, even though they are not married, and whether or not Amy should murder Susan. Roxana also has some debates with the merchant about the benefits of marriage, and whether or not it serves women's interests. These debates highlight the difference in personality and class background between Amy and Roxana, as well as their deeper similarities. Amy is pragmatic, blunt, and street smart. Because she comes from a less privileged background, she does not have the luxury of being idealistic. Roxana is more tied to conventions of morality, and also worried about her reputation and social position. However, even though Roxana is also hesitant about some of these actions initially, she can see the value of them, and the opportunities they might create. In addition to highlighting this character development, the theme of moral ambiguity and debate allows Defoe to embed examples of casuistry, a kind of moral reasoning for resolving ethical problems, into his novel. Wealth. Wealth is a predominant theme in the novel because it essentially becomes Roxana's obsession. She learns early in life that wealth is perilous and can be lost through financial mismanagement. The trauma of going bankrupt and having to give up her children leads her to become obsessed with achieving financial security for herself. However, the novel hints that a focus on money can become a type of addiction and lead to unhealthy patterns of greed. Once Roxana has acquired enough money that she is comfortable, she does not stop trying to acquire money. Instead, she wants to push the boundaries and see how much she is able to acquire. Roxana keeps pushing herself to gain more and more wealth until she can no longer recall why this was so important to her. She also prioritizes wealth ahead of relationships, and this almost ends up costing her her relationship with the merchant, whom she actually loves. The novel is ultimately ambiguous about the theme of wealth, showing how it can be both a force of empowerment but also a source of corruption. Motherhood. Despite Roxana giving birth to many children, motherhood does not always seem to be important to her. However, the later part of the novel reveals that motherhood is indeed a prominent theme of the novel. Although she doesn't seem to think much about them while she is abroad, Roxana is very eager to find her 5 children once she returns to England. She not only provides for them financially, but she changes her whole lifestyle in hopes that she might be able to build relationships with them. Whenever Roxana is physically in the same space as her daughters, she has a very strong reaction to being close to them. It is also made clear that she is grief-stricken when she first has to give up her children. However, Roxana can be ambivalent about some of her other children. She actively dislikes the son she has with the merchant, and tries to avoid spending time with him. She also seems unmoved when one of her sons with the prince dies in Italy. Also, while she clearly does have some love for her daughter Susan, she only wants to love the girl on her own terms. Roxana does not want to ever admit the truth to Susan unless she can protect her own interests and identity. Roxana also seems somewhat unmoved by Susan's strong emotions about wanting to be claimed by her mother. Secrecy and lies. Because Roxana reinvents herself a number of times, and conceals her previous identity each time, she ends up living within a web of secrets and lies. Amy is the only person who ends up with full access to Roxana's history. Roxana's secrecy begins when she misrepresents herself as the legitimate wife of the jeweler upon his death, in order to claim money and assets. After that, she stacks lie atop of lie, adopting other fake personas when she returns to England and when she moves in with the Quaker and tries to leave her scandalous past behind. Roxana's secrecy and lies are such a dominant theme that readers never even learn her true name, other than a hint that she might have been called Susan. While Roxana is very skilled and competent in the art of secrecy, she ends up always living in fear, no matter how wealthy and powerful she becomes. As is shown when Susan starts investigating, everything Roxana has built could come tumbling down if her true history is revealed. The theme of secrecy shows how lonely and isolating living a lie can be. Roxana loves both the Quaker and the merchant, but she can never be truly honest with either of them. Part of the reason why Roxana is so attached to Amy is that Amy is the one person who truly knows her, and therefore Roxana cannot bear to be parted from her, even after Amy almost certainly murders her daughter. Travel and mobility. Throughout the novel, Roxana moves from place to place quite often, living in multiple countries, and often going on extended trips. The theme of travel and mobility adds narrative interest to the story, showing that she is glamorous and cosmopolitan. When Roxana makes her debut as a courtesan in London, her connection to the East via her Turkish costume marks her out as special and desirable. Roxana's ability to move from place also demonstrates that she has been successful at achieving her freedom as a wealthy and independent woman of means. She can go where she wants at a time when this would not have been possible for many women. However, Roxana's mobility is also necessitated because of her lies and fake identities. If she had not built her fortune on a web of lies, she would not have had to move around so much, and could have chosen a more stable life if she had desired. Indeed, many of Roxana's moves come from her needing to run away and avoid detection, not because she is going to places she desires to be. Social class. Social class is an important theme in the novel, especially since Defoe was writing at a time when the relationship between class and wealth was changing in English society. Aristocratic individuals who held titles and landed estates were not necessarily as wealthy or financially secure as individuals who ran a business and could make money for themselves, even though anyone from the professional classes would typically have been considered of a lower social station. Roxana comes to function as a businesswoman, making money and then investing it to increase her profits. She also sees the merchant as the most financially secure man she can be with, and wants her own sons to pursue a similar career path. Nonetheless, Roxana longs for the status that comes with a title, hence why she persuades the merchant to buy them titles in both England and Holland. However, by showing characters purchasing titles rather than inheriting them through legitimate succession, Defoe makes the point that the idea of class and social mobility had changed forever by this point in history.